Hey, I'm Sanjay Sharma. I'm the founder and CEO of Marginal Media Works. This is Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing.
Yeah. My name is Abhay and I share conversations with talented and interesting individuals linked to the global Indian and South Asian community. It's informal and informative, adding insights to our evolving cultural expressions, where each person can proudly say, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. I think I'm delighted for sure. I'm pleased for sure. I'm grateful that this is happening after I think a long time. But more than anything else, I just discovered that this might be the session that unspools everything for the both of us. But really, it's a treat to get joined today by my friend Sanjay Sharma, the founder and CEO of Marginal Media. Sanjay, thanks, man, for making this happen.
Thank you, man. It's an honor to be here. I got
Tell me.
connected to you by a previous guest of yours, so.
That's true. Yes, and I think we have some common threads in that way, and it's fun to make the sort of 1 to 2 degrees of Indian separation, as they
Yeah, man.
say.
Yeah.
But I will ask you this. I mean, the important work you're doing, all the intersections that you live in these days. I wanted to start out by just a sort of general thought, which is when you think about the work you do, what margins do you actually find yourself focusing on these days? Either professionally or personally.
Mm-hmm. Professionally and personally. So I have always loved subcultures. And so our thesis from the beginning was pretty simple, was that the coolest shit happens in the margins. And that was something I grew up feeling a part of: skateboarding, heavy metal, hip hop, just, kind of outsider culture, not necessarily identifying it as anything to do one to one with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. Although as you get older, you start to you go to college and you start to learn that, like, oh, there's a reason all these things generally emanate through some overlap of those. Right.
Yeah.
And so I just love being in subcultures and underground cultures, and think that those communities drive just outsized import on cultural value, commercial value, and often that value is extracted and appropriated once it breaks through, right? So these days, I mean, I love the intersection between kind of Black Asian culture. I've always loved that. And there's a tradition of that, from the Wu-Tang Clan to today.
Yeah.
I love the kind of Black and brown intersection. I love queer, trans, race intersections. And I really love them as they hit, kind of call it cultural industries like streetwear, film, TV, obviously, music, young, MA, amazing queer rapper. These are kind of the worlds I love these days. And I'm lucky in that the personal and the professional map pretty similarly. Those are the things I love to do in my free time. So
no, that's nice when they intersect and they weave in pretty naturally like that. As someone who's, like you said, you've lived in that space, you love that space, you work in that space, and to a degree, that space becomes a commercial endeavor too. Is there a fine line between, again, sort of like the academics of how that borders upon showcasing and presenting versus exploited and over commercialized? And usually when it gets to that layer, it starts becoming less of a margin in that matter, less of a display of that margin.
Yeah.
So as the attention spans and the life cycles of these things shorten, especially in the current zeitgeist, how do you help define what those margins are?
Yeah.
Do you have to constantly revisit that on an ongoing basis for yourself, for that matter, too?
Yeah.
Because some of the margins that you just discussed, I mean, they definitely wax with some nostalgia about what it was like to live in those margins. But as that changes, in some cases, minute to minute, do you have to re-examine, maybe even redefine what the idea of a margin is?
I think the kind of more recent attention to, largely from like academic circles, that's now come into more popular conversation around topics like intersectionality, are fairly new. Obviously, it's always existed, but thinking about the world and culture and identity through multiple lenses and not just a single defining lens, right? You are South Asian. It's like, well, you might be many things. That happens to be one of them. And layering in gender, identity, socioeconomic class, all of these kind of elements of someone's complex elements that make up someone's identity have become way more fluid and porous. And that ultimately is a good thing because identity, I think, has in some ways grown to be a limiting function and not a liberating function.
Yeah.
And so that constant reexamination, I think, is probably good if you're self-aware and want other people to be self-aware. That reexamination is always a good thing.
Yeah.
For the business, these are, I think, exciting times precisely for this reason that more and more people, I think, are feeling like I am fluid on many dimensions, and there is a spectrum across all of these things. I am not just one thing, right?
Yeah.
And so for recording artists or artists, but we deal mostly with like visual storytellers,
Yeah.
filmmakers, right? Our hope in starting the company was that could be a liberating function, right? You in Hollywood, you may be seen as, if you're an Indian immigrant, you would be told, write something about that. And the assumption would be write something about how hard it is to be an Indian immigrant, right? Whereas you may have grown up watching Steven Spielberg movies, James Bond movies, and got attracted to the idea of becoming a writer to write big canvas action movies.
Not so much that immigrant experience.
And so this idea that you don't have to this industry that we all grew up loving, watching, or many of us, but never reflected us, and yet we somehow followed all the stories, didn't miss anything, didn't feel like I can't relate to that.
That's right.
Right, like my parents,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We all American Pie. It's like, well, those parents aren't like my parents.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Right. And so this kind of idea, the idea of reimagining or we call it reappropriating Western cinema through these very commercial genres, prototypes, kind of archetype films, right?
Yeah.
A bank heist, a road trip movie, a stoner comedy,
Right.
with people who look like the people we grew up with, right? And so I think of that classic kind of Spielbergian scene where like kids are riding bikes through the neighborhood, or a Stephen King movie for that matter, right? And you and I were in that group riding bikes, and if you kept going and turned left around the corner, that was our house.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
But if you look through kind of 70s, 80s, even 90s American cinema, you would think that none of us were here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so re-examining all that stuff, I think, is important. And as things break and become more popular, there is this question of like authenticity and how real is it still? But if you pick any of those, call it creator classes or art forms, for lack of better terms, think of hip hop, which is still seen by many people as a niche form of music, right? Whereas it really is pop music now. It is the most streamed category of music in nearly every territory of the world around the world. So it's by definition not niche, right? But there's still real ones.
And
and
the funny
and
part
this
about
Kendrick and Drake beef illustrates,
right.
the difference between pop and real ones in hip hop.
Yeah.
So there's still an authentic original art form that comes from the tradition of the origins, which were very much in the margins and still remain there and really true. And so if you love the form, if you love the craft, then you know how to get to what's real, and other people recognize what's real. And so for us, it's deciphering in streetwear, in any of these kind of, call it cultural industries, who are the real authentic people making this art.
I have one thought on that one, and that is that as an executive, as someone who has a more than just a front row seat and a street side view of that, but you live at that 35,000 foot level as well. When it comes to the realism of an art form, and also taking the temperature of how rapidly things change, and how they, this dance between what pop is and say what hip hop is, does that take practice as an executive, where you have to understand what the definitions of that are, related back to a specific artist or a specific movie genre or a specific Spielbergian theme where you're thinking, look, this has some texture to it. It's actually a lot more fluid than the definition of what a specific artist is doing or what a specific filmmaker is doing.
Mm,
Is that something that you've had to iterate on a little bit so
yeah.
that you can
Yeah.
get to a point where you see that fluidity a little bit more than the specificity of a specific creator or an art piece?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think this is you're up in the valley. I think it's what kind of venture people call pattern recognition, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so some of that, maybe an overly used term, but I think some of that comes from lived experience. Some of it comes from genuine interest and passion around, whatever the subject matter is. Like,
Right.
this is the music I've grown up listening to and continue to listen to in my free time. I love finding new artists. I love when my kids put me on to somebody new, so you just have to, if you love staying current, then you kind of see what's really happening.
Yeah. Almost like you
Same with,
keep listening, you keep
yeah,
looking for it. You have to sort of keep
yeah.
that top
And
of mind.
I have a bunch of friends, probably like our peer group of
Yeah.
people who grew up in like the heyday of Wu-Tang, Tribe Called Quest,
Right.
Tupac, kind of that era, who are really like, man, hip hop fell off. I don't know what these
Right.
kids listen
Right.
to. This is
Yeah.
crazy. None of this is any good. It doesn't even sound like music.
Yeah.
And I'm not. It sounds very different, but you kind of got to you got to be open to how the medium is evolving.
Right.
And I think a similar thing happens with indie film. If you've grown up watching American cinema or any country's cinema, that's just the one that I know the most. Even Indian movies, if I grew up watching nothing but
Yeah.
Bollywood movies every weekend for most of my young years, and that medium has changed. And I think you just develop through your lived experience, your personal passions. I wouldn't take away from the luxury of a pretty sound academic training in
Yeah.
studied film in college, and so like seeing like French New Wave and seeing
Yeah.
kind of international cinema, and then you start to see patterns, right? You start to see filmmakers who have similarities, and it's when you study them then you realize, oh, because he was influenced by her and she was
Mm,
influenced by him, and then this
right.
person was influenced, so you just see that lineage, and then you can kind of spot what the in visual medium you can spot
Right.
the references down to a frame that was framed this way. That's an
Yeah.
homage to Hitchcock, right?
It's kind of like the lineage and the trees that get developed from a particular, I'm sure somebody out there is making music that you can link directly back to Q-Tip.
Totally. Yep. Of
And
course. Yep.
Hanuman Kind's music is going to
Yep.
be somewhat of a connect the dot experience to something else. So, um,
Exactly.
you know,
Exactly. Big
and
stepper.
when you think about film and media and all that intersectionality that you just mentioned, there's a definite change that's happened in the last few months in at least the sociopolitical zeitgeist of the country, where the temperature and appetite have very palpably shifted away from those margins
Uh-huh.
and shifted to the centers. And for at least the time being, whether that's temporary or not, has really created the opportunity for new margins to be identified, especially new margins to be identified that the ecosystems may not even be aware of at this point. So I guess the thought that I had is, I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on this evolution over these last several months, if not years, because I
Uh-huh.
think this has been sort of in the making for some time, but reflecting on that evolution. And for the most part, then what's the strategy to, in fact, navigate through that?
Hmm.
Especially as someone who's had some great experience in thinking about not only those margins, but how to be ladders of opportunity for people who live on those margins.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the part where I get denaturalized.
Yeah, no, right. The risk. We're just gonna like put the disclaimer out there, right? Like we're both gonna stay in the country.
This is,
Um,
I mean, as you know from our prior conversations, I love politics and history just as a pastime. But look, this climate is like nothing I've ever seen, and I didn't think I was particularly naive. I'm sort of the shock and awe campaign is working,
mm,
and the what Steve Bannon calls muzzle velocity around the rapid fire executive orders and kind of taking universities down, extracting students from class is literally insane. The association with anything that has to do with the dreaded 3-letter DEI
Mm-hmm.
is real and palpable. And in our industry, which has a tradition of being seen as progressive and liberal, has fled from it. Major institutions have fled from it.
Mm-hmm.
Major corporations have fled from it, right? And so I think a couple of things have happened. It's obviously a ton to unpack, and we could spend the whole session talking about this,
Right. Right.
and I'd love to. I think a few things have happened. One is many marginalized communities, historically marginalized communities, over time, the left or the progressives or the Democrats have kind of lost them. And I think part of that is this sort of single identity focused aperture
Mm.
around you're Latino, you're Asian, right? You're good. You're part of our team, right?
Right.
And the lack of understanding that people have a lot of different interests that make up their identity. Unfortunately, I think we've seen a lot of people in our personal communities gravitate right. Many of them always were right. Like, let's
Yeah.
be honest, a lot
Yeah.
of Asian immigrants don't come here as radical progressives. Like,
Sure.
luckily my parents happen to be, but many of them are super conservative, right?
Yeah.
Don't believe in LGBTQ rights, don't believe that, people should be given so-called handouts, right? They think we came here, we worked hard, right?
Right.
And forget that they may have come here with PhDs,
Yeah.
even though they had $3 in their pocket, right? And so that sort of interweaving from the margins into, call it the center, right?
Mm.
Although I question if it's really the center. I think the center since Reagan has just gone increasingly to the right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And on the left, we've continued to say, let's compromise, let's moderate. And we've been dragged to the to the right, right? In the world of like storytelling, I think these are real opportunities because I think institutional understanding of or the institutional reaction to this is let's be safe and revert back to what we used to do, right?
Mm.
And there's
Yeah.
this notion of returning to the center,
Right.
and that the safe default is go back to making the kinds of movies we used to make with the people we always made them with the stars who have always worked for us in the past, right? And that I think is a that existential crisis for Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
Because those are the kinds of movies that for the last 22, 23 years have
Or
yielded
more.
declining ticket sales in US theaters
Yeah.
since 2000.
Yeah.
So this sort of like return to the past is like, how's that been doing for you? It has
Right.
not been doing well for you for 20 plus years. So what past are you returning to? And if not that Hollywood is a great proxy for the rest of the country, but I do think in this case, it is the same question, right? What
Yeah.
great past are we talking about? Whose
Right.
great past are we talking about?
I actually think that question is even more fascinating of whose great past are we talking about, right? Because I think what great past are we talking about, people can actually define that on their own. But
Right.
whose great past are we talking about really depends on who's asking the question in the first
That's
place
right.
and then who's presenting it.
That's right.
This notion then of gravitating towards some sort of ideologic center, especially in your space, does that mean that the center of where those levers of power and capital exist depend on, in a way, recalibrating back to this notion of we need to make content that reminds us of some, however ill-defined past
Uh-huh.
we're talking about here? I mean, like, are we really seeing a shift not just in the ideology of what storytelling is or what storytelling needs to be, but also where the capital and the power levers lie in 2025?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Although I guess I wouldn't say we're seeing a shift. My personal view is that never really shifted,
Mm, yeah. Right.
right? And that's kind of the great like irony of this backlash against DEI, certainly in Hollywood, but broadly across like the corporate kind of Fortune 500 public company spectrum, is there was never really that much of a movement to begin with. The
Yeah.
perception really is far beyond the reality on this one, right?
Mm.
So in our industry, short of a number of big announcements by the major studios and streamers, which, mind you, were generally made during COVID lockdown in the wake of George Floyd's murder, right?
Right.
Announcements like we're doubling down and doing $100 million minority creator fund and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
That was during a time where there was no production going on anyway.
Yeah.
So that money couldn't really be deployed, right? And then fast forward a year, 2 years, there was a double strike that took the industry out for another year. So this last, we call it the 2020s, have been arguably the most challenged environment in the film TV industry in its lifespan, and really a kind of shutdown in production, right?
Yeah.
So easy times to promise gifts,
Right.
right?
Right.
And not have to deliver on them. Right. So not that much happened. Some deals, some overall deals, some first look deals, more expansion of the pie for large talent who have already made it, right? It's easy
Yeah.
to say, I'm going to do another big movie with Ava DuVernay, another show with Shonda. They're established hit
Yeah.
makers, right?
Yeah. They're
And
not on the margins.
and God bless them, and
Yeah.
absolutely deserve everything they get and more. That's not the same as we're bringing in emerging new talent, right?
Yeah.
And those are people you're already in business with and you're going to continue to remain in business with, right? So
Mm.
it's not really a redistributive kind of approach to changing the narrative system. It's doubling down on the existing narrative system, right? And that I say the irony of that never having really changed, because if you ask filmmakers of color what changed in the last few years, I think most of them would say not much.
Yeah.
Right? There was definitely a feeling that things were going to change, and
Yeah.
a few examples of some things that probably a project or two that went that might not have otherwise, or a filmmaker that might have gotten a first shot.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
but
But nothing
nothing that I would,
seismic.
yeah, nothing seismic, right?
Yeah.
And clearly nothing of any permanence, right?
Yeah.
Because it was that easy to say we're doing away with all the shit,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we've heard a lot of executives say things like, and this is, by the way, even before Trump took office, this pendulum had already started swinging back,
Sure.
where executives were saying things like, we don't have the luxury of diversity anymore.
Mm.
We can't afford diversity anymore, which, for us is like, it's not a luxury, it's a demographic reality
Yeah.
that it's sort of an existential crisis if you don't understand the demographics of the country, if you don't understand the growing cultural centers around the world and their influence and their importance for international streaming markets, LATAM, South Asia, Southeast Asia,
Yeah.
then you won't live in the next 100 years of media.
Yeah.
But that perception in Hollywood has just never really stuck. And I think it's because most of the incumbent power don't really know those worlds. So their value suddenly is like, well, I don't know any hot Singaporean filmmakers.
Right.
Where's my value? Right.
Yeah. Do you have to therefore be a fulcrum in order to evangelize some of that? Is it your job to do that? Or do you have to create your own lane and live outside of that conversation? Or both, for that matter?
I mean, I thought it would be the former when I started the company, but it turns out to be the latter.
Yeah.
The internal kind of the insularity and hegemony of the, call it, incumbent system is even more dogged than I bargained for, right? And I've been in it,
Impenetrable, by the way? Or,
yeah, virtually impenetrable, right?
yeah.
And so when I worked in the traditional media business early in my career at Warner
Yeah.
Brothers, and have been in and out of the, call it, traditional media business, left and went into tech startups, and then one of the companies I helped start and lead became a pretty big digital video company built entirely on top of YouTube, was eventually acquired by a major movie studio, Warner
Was is
Brothers.
it Machinima or
Machinima.
Machinima?
Yeah, Machinima.
Nice, thank you.
You're close. You're
Yeah,
close. And so, starting inside of the studio system, working on, the Matrix movies, the Chris Nolan Batman movies, the
yeah,
Oceans movies, some of the, at the time, biggest movies in the history of filmed entertainment.
right.
And even at that time, feeling like this is mid 2000s in the outside world, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, YouTube, the iPhone, the pace of change is just frenetic.
Staggering. Yeah,
And inside the studio, it may as well have been the 80s,
yeah,
right? Leaving and then 10 years later, selling a company to Warner Brothers and re engaging in the studio system and feeling like it still feels pretty much the same.
yeah. Nothing's changed.
It's the same people. I don't
Yeah,
mean similar people. I mean the same person is in the same seat,
yeah,
same
yeah.
office, same desk.
Literally. Yeah,
And then starting this company another 5 years now, almost 10 years later, there was a funny quote by Jerry Bruckheimer, kind of the storied mega franchise producer, when they were making the Top Gun sequel, Maverick, that he had asked every agency head, calls Brian Lord, Ari Emanuel, give me your top 10, actors right now. And Jerry Bruckheimer, who is an old legend, says he was shocked to see that like the same 10 names were on that list,
right.
mostly from every agency from when they made the first Top Gun.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the longevity of Val Kilmer, I guess, to speak to that. But the notion that those seats, those people, the vernacular and the language, and even just the actual thought process is not very much change, which maybe speaks to the impenetrance of what
Right.
that circle is. If you have to be someone who then creates your own lane, who is part of a different structure where you build the mechanism and the architecture and for that matter the capital around
Mm-hmm.
you so that you can make your own sort of ecosystem in that way. Is it the kind of thing where as you iterate that you're hoping parallels the other system, hoping collaborates with the other system, hoping lives together in some
Uh-huh.
sort of like coexistent jungle?
Uh-huh.
How does this all play out?
Yeah, great question. So we have built largely outside the system, but they have to work together, right?
Yeah,
Because in this industry, unlike music in some ways, the distribution is still in the hands of a select group of players, right? So you could, almost anyone can make a movie. You can put it up on YouTube and no one will see it, right?
yeah,
With some exceptions. And so ultimately, our view on this thing is we are symbiotic to the traditional industry. We have projects with some of the big studios. Who knows if they will ever get made? I'm not planning or betting on them ever getting made.
mm,
Because that traditional theatrical studio development process through production, through distribution, and there are fewer studios now, and they're making fewer movies, right? And so our view was you can't, if you're building a traditional production company where that is, those are your kind of dependent partners, then you're building a company for the studios of the last 100 years. And
mm,
our view was let's start a company, rightly or wrongly, win or lose, that is a studio for the next 100 years. And
right,
so that means you're independent from the studio system. You may sell into the studio system. You may go make projects and have distributors buy those projects, but they're not gating function. You can get through those gates on your own, right?
right, right,
Um, and I think over time, and there, by the way, it's not unique. There are companies that have done this and done it masterfully. That could be A24, that could be Blumhouse, that could be Tyler Perry and Tyler Perry Studios, who truly did it on his own outside
mm,
of the system.
yeah,
So there are players who are lighting this path. So it wasn't like no one's ever done it and we think we can. Not that it's easy, it's obviously incredibly hard, but
Sure.
A24 is now a $3.5 billion company. Blumhouse is not, its valuation is not privately known. I don't believe they've taken outside capital, but their close corporate relationship with Universal Studios. My guess is if it were a private company and raised outside capital, it'd be a $2-3 billion company as well, right?
Sure.
Maybe more than I wouldn't be surprised if it's worth more than A24.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so we do think there is an opportunity now, maybe for the first time in the, call it, 100-year history of filmed entertainment, for the new studios of the next 100 years to be born. This is the time they will be born, right?
Mm.
Whether we make it or not, and even if we don't, our goal, look, if we turn into the next Warner Brothers or the next A24, that's amazing. But if we die along the way and we got 10 movies, 20 movies, 30 movies made by first time filmmakers of color, then we played our part in
Right.
expanding the ecosystem and in changing the narrative system of Hollywood.
I want to go on that same thread because if the end game is either or if not, hopefully both, where you do change that narrative and you exist for another 100 years, or at least the mission exists for another 100 years. In your mind and in your own sort of heart and soul, are you an Indian American media executive? Are you a South Asian American media
Right.
executive? Do you think of yourself in that way? Or and for that matter, does that label even matter?
Yeah,
Um,
that is a good question. I mean, I am, yeah, I think of myself as kind of I think of myself as an Asian American, South Asian American media executive. I generally default to American, and part of why I do that is partly patriotism, but partly an assertion that we are American,
yeah. Yeah.
right? You were born here. I was naturalized in the middle school. So I actually, unlike a lot of Americans, had to work hard to become American.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, there was some effort involved.
There was take tests,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so I love the idea of just framing it as like, I don't think I have a Wikipedia entry, but if it just said American media executive, right?
Mm.
American entrepreneur. And I say that, and I think about this often. It's a great question because it's not to hide from being an Asian executive,
Yeah.
Asian American or South Asian, not hiding from that at all, embrace that and lean into that as well, right? But it's the hyphenate is double-edged in some ways, right? Because the hyphenization of it, the thing I would hate for it to do is to take away from the singularity of owning being American, right?
Like that part of your identity speaks very loudly to your work. And aside from your name, is there a thread that lives in your work that is distinctly Indian? There
Mm.
are there elements of your leadership that are components of your Indianness or your
Yeah.
South Asian Americanness or your Asian Americanness.
Yeah.
And for that matter, does that actually matter to you or the people you work with?
Yeah. I think it absolutely matters to me. I don't know if it matters to the people I work with. And I don't know if they can tell or not,
Right.
honestly. But there are definitely elements to it that are kind of our, I think, cultural heritage and lineage without generalizing, obviously, because it's a big country with a lot of people. But I do think humility and humbleness is something, we are raised with. We're generally not super brash, arrogant know it alls. There are obviously exceptions, certain FBI directors. uh,
Okay, deportation clue number two coming up. But I mean, that notion that you mentioned, right? You have an experience as an immigrant
right,
that I don't,
right, right,
and
right,
there's unto itself. Someone could look at the both of us on this screen right now, and they say, "Hey, there's two South Asian Americans or Indian Americans," but our lived experiences might be completely different here.
right, 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 exactly, right.
Yeah,
And so, I was young when we moved here, but
yeah,
technically, first I was not born here,
yeah,
and my parents were older when they immigrated here. They didn't come here as college students or grad students, right? Like a lot of Asian immigrants who you came here in the late 70s, mine came in the early 70s, right? And they were already, my dad was already a professor, right? And so we were raised with some of these, call it traditional values. My parents are not super religious. They're not, they're atheists and Marxists. So,
Yeah.
was raised kind of with a ethical and cultural compass, but not really a religious one.
Sure.
We'd go to puja every Sunday, but my parents are like, it's like social hanging out, right?
And some of those anchors maybe are a little bit different in growing up in Baton Rouge versus
That's right.
growing up in Los Angeles
Total,
and a different
total.
metropolis. So
Yeah. So I do think there are, at my leadership style or the way I look at building teams is a little. It's definitely not what Elon would call hardcore. It's probably the opposite.
right.
It is much more empathetic and compassionate in some, we're trying to build an ethical framework for running a business and growing the business. Don't believe it has to be hard edge all the time.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you don't have to grind. And that's another probably cultural value, which is maybe not a good one, but I work just insanely hard
Yeah.
every day
Well,
of the week, morning
yeah.
till night. And startups are, kind of full contact sports. Like
Yeah.
if you want a 9 to 5 job, then being in a startup environment is probably not the right fit for you, right? You do this as a side job, right? So just that work ethic, and not to play into, model minority tropes, but the work ethic I was definitely raised with, you got to grind, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but that was not antithetical to treat people kindly, treat people with respect,
Sure. Not at the
respect,
expense of.
yeah, not at the expense of other people's dignity or their health, right? And there is a way to balance that. They're not mutually exclusive, right? So yeah, I do think there's definitely a clear Indian, South Asian cultural values that I walk with every day. They may not be obvious to the people around me.
Right. Right. And I mean, I think they inform you. You are aware of it, and on top of that, how they manifest themselves in your own day to day, even sort of like your worldview as a person of color and as someone who is leading as a professional. It speaks to sort of like the growth and how you navigate through that growth. And I want to touch on one thing, as far as like the startup culture that you just mentioned here. When you go from a startup to a bigger orbit and now find yourself within an establishment, or at least, again, having to be symbiotic with an establishment, what do you think leaders like you need to unlearn about themselves to sort of successfully make that growth transition, if you
Mhm.
will, without losing or even risking the kind of basics of their mission, vision, values?
There's definitely, and I don't know that I've been great at this, but I think once you hit kind of this step function up into another tier of whatever it is, entrepreneurship or management, senior management or something like that,
Yeah,
when you're going from, hey, I'm managing a team of 3 to I'm managing a team of 30 to I'm running a company of 300 to what, and I haven't built companies that much bigger than that, but you kind of have to unlearn a lot of things at each step. And you realize, I think, that the very skills that got you to step 1 may not be the skills that are helpful for step 2. In fact, they may be detrimental,
mm,
right?
yeah,
um but it's a good question. It's a tough question because I think you have to, in some ways, harden up a little bit once you're running bigger organizations and managing lots of people. It is harder to have individual personal relationships and, hey, my door's always open and come in anytime. That's easy when it's a small company. Once
yeah,
you've got 200 people, 300 people, you just can't have your door open all the time or you don't get
yeah,
anything done, right?
yep,
Hierarchy, I think, starts to fall into place, and you kind of have to unlearn having a personal relationship with everyone can be counterproductive when there's two layers of managers between you and line
Hmm.
employee,
Yeah.
and people can't feel like they can go around their boss and come straight to you. It undercuts the manager in between, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
You made layers for a reason, right?
yeah, right,
Yeah.
right, right. And so you kind of have to learn how to and that's why I like 0 to 1 very early stage startups, which are probably the hardest stage, but just the most fun, the most fluid, the most kind of like 5-person team
Yeah.
basketball squad.
Right. Right.
Everyone's carrying
Right.
something, right?
Yeah.
And you kind of move up and down the court together. Once the organizations get bigger, you have to surrender a little bit to system and process and implement system and process. And that is that level of scaling. Some of the other guests on your show have way more experience than I do, and I got to learn that. Hopefully this company gets bigger, and I'll have to relearn and
Right.
unlearn.
Yeah. Well, but you mentioned a word that's often a common theme there, right? It's just like what do you actually let go of? What do you surrender to? What do you actually unimplement, if you will? And
Mhm.
how do you sort of like recalibrate and redefine the confines of what you do? We could talk about all this forever, but I want to get you out of here on this one, which is those intersections that you live in. And again, this notion of intersectionality has been around for a long time, but the ones that you particularly live in, whether it's entrepreneurial venture or media or tech, particularly in a era where we're kind of at these different inflection points, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in any industry for that matter, but particularly in the media space, this inflection point of tech formerly being an important collaborator, growing to being a very key stakeholder, to in many ways being viewed at as, like it or not, potentially a threatening driver of the work. What makes you, in seeing that evolution, what makes you optimistic about that intersection of media and tech, particularly from a very relationship and sort of human lens?
Mhm. Yeah,
Hopefully that makes sense, by the
yeah.
way.
I think so. I think it makes sense. I'm just pausing because it's a good question, especially at this moment in time for the media industry, which, you know, stock prices off historic, probably 30-year lows over the last few years, partly pandemic, partly strikes, but generally secular trends. Like I said, I think people forget that percentage of household income spent on movies you know, is lower than it's ever been.
Yeah.
And US ticket sales have been declining since 2000, 2002, but not a healthy, robust, growing industry. So, technology, I think this is one of the few industries out there that are multi-$100 billion global industries that have not been totally dislocated by technology. That has started to happen with Netflix, obviously, but even that is really distribution, right? Distributing movies through the internet into your personal device or home, right?
Right. Right.
It has not really changed the way the industry, the DNA of the industry is still the same as it's been, right? Most of the executives who work at Netflix, Amazon years ago worked at Warner Brothers, Disney, Paramount, Sony, or Fox, right? So it's still the same people with the same ways of thinking, the same relationships and networks, the same ways of valuing talent and source material and content, right? And that thinking has remains very centered and has defaulted even more so to big IP and big talent, right?
Yeah.
And so that we think is an opportunity for technology to really create operating leverage in new studios and to really create a democratizing effect on studios in the way technology created a democratizing effect on music, right?
Yeah.
So cost of production came down, distribution became essentially ubiquitous direct to consumer, and artists like Chance the Rapper could get discovered on SoundCloud, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And SoundCloud may not be the best example, but Spotify for sure Now you have more people creating music, producing music, and releasing music than ever. Discovery obviously is still a huge problem. That's why I think you will continue to need curatorial brands that stand for something.
Mm,
And that's what Def Jam Records was. That's what Interscope was. That's what Capitol and Motown were and still are. That's
right.
what A24 has become. That's what Blumhouse is. That's what Tyler Perry Studio is. You kind of have a sense of what you're getting, right? And so we see technology as a tool, an enabler, and especially with AI, a very democratizing tool, but nothing replaces human creativity, human storytelling, human connections, human performance, right? There are proxies for those things. We see these tool sets and we're quietly working away on some of these things and matching them with data, which is widely available around what audiences are responding to and like and want to see more of, which talent is emerging,
Yeah.
as just a new way of finding material, finding talent in the margins that Hollywood isn't looking for, doesn't know how to look for, even if they found, would say, I don't think that kid's a star, right? And we would say, well, we disagree, right? And
Right.
so we're quietly chipping away at, what are the different ways we can apply technology to this industry that
Mm,
has been and remains fairly analog still, to build a new kind of, I describe it as like an operating system
right.
underneath the studio. And if we saw the studio of the next 100 years, whether we do it or not, it has to have a technology foundation behind it that will enable it to look at the world's talent, the world's stories, the world's content creators in a totally different way versus the insular, purely relationship industry as it's historically been.
Well, on that note, as someone who is making the world look at these questions and look at that infrastructure in a totally democratized and accessible way with a lot of harmony between those human relationships and the tech out there, I think more and more people are becoming really aware of your work and appreciative of it. And I know that there are a lot of teams and people out there who are looking to you for both thought leadership, but then also all the work you're doing as really beacons of light in many corners. So Sanjay, thank you so much. Honestly, we could have talked forever about all this stuff, and I really appreciate you being here with us. I hope we can visit with you again down the road.
Dude, really my pleasure. Long time listener, first time guest.
There
Keep
you
up the work.
go.
Really a
Well,
pleasure, man. Long overdue.
long overdue. We'll do it again. You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Stay tuned.